It's okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from all around the world. And thanks for joining our webinar. My name is Saltnat Mashirova, and I'm president of ISACA Nur-Sultan chapter. I also work for Honeywell as an advanced cybersecurity architect engineer. So this webinar is a joint webinar between ISACA Nur-Sultan chapter and IAA Kazakhstan chapter. So the webinar's topic is today accessing the risk of your cloud deployment, the CSA's control framework, and becoming CCAK certified. We're honored to have you, Ted, as a speaker, as a presenter, certified ISACA instructor, and he has taught many organizations and governments CCAK class. Also, he teaches CISA, CISM, CRIS classes around the globe. In addition to that, he also teaches IC Square like CISSP, CCSP classes as well. Before starting our webinar, let me tell some rules. First of all, please keep your microphone muted. If you have any question to the TED during the session, please post it in the chat. Since I'm a moderator, I will read your question to the TED at the end of the session. Our session will be 90 minutes because we have a lot to talk about cloud and also about CPE credits for ISACA members globally. I will issue 1.5 hour CPE credits after webinar. And for IAA members, Evgenia will issue certificate as well. So before starting webinar, Evgenia Rosova, for a few words, she's the president of IAA Kazakhstan. Floor is yours, Evgenia.
Thank you, Sultanat. I'm happy to welcome everyone on this webinar. I think this is quite an important topic in today's environment because everyone is moving to the cloud, but hardly paying attention to the real risks starting on the background. So I'm really happy to host this event on the behalf of the IAA Kazakhstan. Yes, and as said by Sultanat, all the certificates for the IAA members who registered for this webinar will be issued by the Institute of Internal Auditors in Kazakhstan. So if you have any questions specific to IAA, you may also send this in the chat. We will handle this at the end. We are doing the recording of this webinar, and it will be posted in about 48 hours on our channel in YouTube. You can just find it by IAA KZ in there if you need, and I will try to add it a bit later to the chat window. Thank you everyone for attending, and Ted, welcome, and I'm passing the word to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, no matter where you are. I am in Aiken, South Carolina, fairly close to Augusta, Georgia. So any of you that are golf fans, you know exactly where I live. As was mentioned a moment ago, I get to teach a lot of different classes. And the CCAK happens to be my new favorite class along with the C-Risk class. And the reason I like it so much is I really enjoy kind of spreading the facts of what the cloud really means to auditors. And I think it's a much more complicated picture than a lot of people assume. A lot of people are making some very bad assumptions. And the analogy I like to draw is you can have a really solid looking piece of wood, but if it's full of termites, it's also full of holes and it's not very stable. So I think the presentation is going to cover a lot of the issues around the cloud and what you as an auditor can deal with. I've put my contact information on the screen if you have any follow-up questions later on. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I've also put in my LinkedIn profile. If you want to do the LinkedIn thing a little bit later on, we can do that as well. I do have a standard disclaimer because unfortunately, This is a complicated topic that is the cloud, largely because of the ramifications from a legal perspective. If you put your stuff in the wrong place, if you try to move your data from one location to another without understanding all of the rules and regulations, you can find yourself in some significant legal jeopardy. So everything I say is based on my experience of the cloud. I am not an attorney. And if there is any legal issue that you are confronting, please contact your attorney first. I've broken this particular session down into a couple of different sections. The first one is, how did we get to where we are right now? There's lots of reasons that companies go to the cloud, not necessarily always good ones. We're going to talk about the results of companies running to the cloud as opposed to having the necessary governance. And then we're going to talk about what I think is probably the most misunderstood aspect of cloud deployment. And that is the whole idea of people assume, well, I'm just going to go to the cloud and AWS or Google or Microsoft is going to take care of everything for me. That's not necessarily the case. Depending on what service you use, and I'll show you some examples of it, part of the problem you're going to have is, how are you gathering the artifacts for any given application that illustrates that everybody has done their part of the shared responsibility model? We'll talk a little bit about what ISACA recommends in terms of governance, and then we will conclude part one, which leads us then into the Cloud Security Alliance. Now, the Cloud Security Alliance is kind of in a very interesting position. It is made up of cloud providers. And I think the issue that they are addressing is one of, I don't want to say obsolescence of a lot of different control frameworks, but the lack of coverage of very specific issues within the cloud that aren't covered by different frameworks. And so we're going to talk about the fact of the Cloud Security Alliance and what problems does the framework solve. A right to audit is not likely to happen for most organizations. We're going to go through the different control families. And my intent with going through the control families in a general kind of way is to simply illustrate the issues that you should be aware of. And there are some in particular where the individual control families and the controls within those control families represent some real challenges. Now, once you understand the control families, part of the issue will be understanding all of the control mappings. So again, if you're using ISO, if you're using NIST, there's a mapping for pretty much everything, including trusted services criteria controls. Once you understand the controls of the Cloud Security Alliance and the control families, and you've mapped what you have to the Cloud Security Alliance, then you're going to have to deal with the control gaps and what are you going to do about those control gaps. Of course, there is, again, no direct assessment of the cloud service provider under most circumstances. So the Cloud Security Alliance has their own forms of assessments. And there are some in place, and there are others that are going to be coming based on technologies that are being currently developed. I will then talk a little bit about the certification course and the exam. It is a jammed-packed full 2 days. And the exam itself is a little on the tricky side. It's not the normal 150 questions, but it can be a little bit challenging. And I'll talk to some specific issues. And then we'll open up the floor for questions and answers. So the first part is, how the heck did we get here in the first place? That is, why are we all running to the cloud? And there are some real interesting reasons for that. And the first one, and this is a topic that's coming up more and more and more, that is the idea of having a digital transformation. So boards of directors are reading the appropriate reports from different places, and they're saying, ooh, we have to do digital transformation as well. So if we take a look at this whole concept of digital transformation, then we come into the problem of, can our existing IT infrastructure execute this vision of a digital transformation? The technologies are getting far, far ahead of a traditional IT infrastructure, as are the skills required to run it. So if we can't run it, what are we going to do? Now, My theory on a good cloud deployment has always been you focus on the data. The data is the most important. The concept of a traditional server and a traditional data center and a traditional network, all of that stuff is gone. It's about compute, it's about network, it's about storage, and it's about all of the data. So if I really want to take advantage, if I want to turn myself into a Google or an Amazon, and I want to do AI and machine learning, to have valid results, I need lots and lots and lots of data that I need to be able to move all over the place. Then there has been the argument of having CapEx versus OpEx, that is capital expenses versus operating expenses. And here I differ with the standard theory. A lot of organizations think they're going to save money. And in some circumstances, that might be very true. But I think the larger problem is that if you follow the models of ISACA and COBIT and all of these different guidances about the alignment of business and IT, if the business actually understands that it's possible now not to have to wait for a built data center to be built or servers to be acquired, physical servers to be acquired, you can spin up whatever you want to spin up. So will you really wind up saving money, or are you going to spend more money? And by the way, one of the interesting aspects of that from a control perspective and a financial perspective is there's budgeting options available from these different platforms. So you can know how much you are spending. So again, I'm somewhat skeptical. And the other analogy I use, oh, you didn't understand that you could buy other things in the cloud. So all of a sudden, the whole idea is that you're going to spend a lot, I think a lot more than you think. Then we have another interesting fact of life that's coming, and that is ESG, especially the E part. Now, if you have to produce an ESG report and you're concerned about the environmental stuff, if you have a traditional data center with traditional servers, you might be burning a lot more in terms of energy than you might want to tell your stockholders about. So by giving it over to a cloud service provider, you may actually achieve some levels of efficiency in being more energy efficient. It also gives you the ability to put and use services in other parts of, in the case of the United States, if I was in California, California is very expensive from an electrical perspective. So then I can move the data, or my data center could be in Arizona, or it could be in Nevada, places where the energy prices are a lot lower. The Carolinas, where I live, is one of those instances as well. Then we come up to some very interesting other issues around regulatory compliance. So we are developing a perfect storm these days around a couple of different laws that are occurring. One of them, which was passed in the European Union recently, is called DORA, and it has to deal with financial institutions managing the cyber risk of their IT environments. In the United States, there is a proposed SEC regulation, which is probably going to happen next month, which is going to require disclosure on SEC forms of the level of cyber risk you have within your organization. Well, if I can't manage all of this stuff, if I can't manage cyber risk, maybe I need to let somebody else help me do that. Then you also have some very interesting incident reporting requirements along with continuous diagnostics and mitigation. I think what you're seeing, at least in the United States, is the division of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, called CCAK, really wanting to know when bad things are happening. Well, if I have lots of data centers all over the world, how am I aggregating all of the necessary data to do that? If I have to report to a data protection authority under GDPR and my resources are scattered all over the world, can I satisfy those requirements for reporting? One of the charms about going to the cloud is the ability to scale up and down. One of the things, and it's tied to the next item with COVID, is all of a sudden, we have a lot more people working virtually. So because we have these virtual workforces and traditional IT may not be able to keep up, having somebody else do it, paying Microsoft, paying Azure, paying AWS, all of these things look like attractive options. There is also the concept of mitigation of risk through control inheritance. So in theory, I don't have to worry about controls specifically around the physical aspects of a data center, because companies like Microsoft and Amazon are going to spend a lot of money protecting their facilities, because security is the reason that a lot of companies will go to the cloud. They don't have the capability of providing that same level of security. But the problem with the mitigation of risk through control inheritance is understanding that there is a shared responsibility model. Another argument that people are making to go to the cloud in the first place is IT is getting so complex, it's not part of our core business, it's distracting us from what we need to do. Just send me a bill at the end of the month and everybody will be happy. Well, all of these are really good reasons to go to the cloud, but what happens if you don't have the necessary governance? If you have inadequate governance, you're not going to be able to assess the risk, including potentially not having the right to audit. Now, again, the Cloud Security Alliance is going to give you some assessments, but again, your right to audit is going to be limited in some circumstances. There is an issue of shadow IT, where people may be unhappy with the pace of the way your organization is deploying applications, and they just take a credit card and they go to Amazon and they buy what they need, and then they put your data in the cloud and you have no idea about what is going on. So you have no idea what's happening to your data. You have no idea of what's happening to your intellectual property, because people are just doing this on their own. Another thing that is fairly common, and I have to tell this kind of amusing story. Whenever I teach a cloud class, I usually start off with this question: how many people have stuff in the cloud? And inevitably everybody's going to raise their hand, because I throw in Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and all that other stuff, and everybody has something in the cloud. How many people have a cloud policy? And fewer hands go up. So part of the problem exists that if you didn't have a policy, you probably didn't assess the risk of going into the cloud, because had you assessed the risk of going into the cloud, you would have had a policy. The other thing, and this is what I find to be probably the biggest problem, is that a lot of the control frameworks, and I'm talking about ISO, I'm talking about NIST, they take a very, very, very long time to update. There's lots of audiences, there's lots of stakeholders. Everything takes a long time. The technology is not waiting. Technology keeps changing all of the time. What I've seen people do is simply a process called lift and shift. So they take their existing IT infrastructure and they duplicate it into the cloud. Well, wait a minute, you just broke a whole bunch of things. Your disaster recovery isn't the same anymore. Your business impact assessment is no longer the same anymore. Your business continuity plan is no longer the same. How are you doing forensic? How are you doing incident response? Where are the log files going? Instead of a lift and shift, what I would focus on is the management of data. Data is the most valuable thing most organizations own. And of course, that is the consolidation of data, also brings some other problems. In the United States, we passed a law called the Cloud Act, which allows law enforcement to subpoena data from other countries that are signatories. It's not a treaty, it's an executive agreement between different parts of government agencies. Well, the problem with that is under GDPR, the European Union doesn't necessarily like the Cloud Act. So could you inadvertently move data from one place to another and get yourself into significant compliance risk? Another thing that I see is people do not understand what they are buying. As an example, there's all kinds of capabilities within the cloud service providers to give you encrypted email, digital rights protection. But if you didn't know about it, you didn't plan for it, you didn't understand the risk of it. And in many cases, the capabilities actually should be examined as being requirements. The cloud stuff is complicated. It's not impossible to learn. But the problem is that if you do it wrong, especially in the area of application development, where's your QA process? Where is the error? How are you separating developers' access to production? If you don't have people, if you have people that go off on their own and misconfigure the APIs the cloud providers give you, you're going to expose your data. It's not going to end well. There is a cost to onboard to the cloud. The AICPA has guidance as to how you would capitalize the expenses of that process. But more importantly, what happens if you had to leave the cloud? It's not happened very frequently because part of the charm of going to the cloud is we can get rid of our data center. Okay, but if the cloud thing doesn't work out, how are you going back? And I do want to bring up one point that is a little controversial, is the idea of, if you say we're in a particular business and a particular industry, what could conceivably happen if you were unpopular for whatever reason, you get kicked off of the cloud? Well, wait a minute, there's an expense of going onto the cloud. It takes a long time to go onto the cloud. You don't know how long it's going to take you to get off of the cloud, how long it's going to take you to get rid of your data in the cloud. If all of those things need to be taken into consideration. And I bring up the next item of broken, everything that winds up being broken. Certainly, your business impact analysis isn't the same anymore. Your business continuity plan isn't the same anymore. And how many availability zones did you buy for your disaster recovery? The traditional model of having a cold site, a warm site, and a hot site, that's all gone. You're buying more availability zones, and some organizations also deal with multiple cloud providers. With forensics, the traditional model has been, I could walk up to somebody's desktop and I could do a forensics investigation. Well, what if that application is now in a virtual machine that is also in the cloud? How are you going to do that for law enforcement purposes? Some other things that can happen. You can really have badly broken system development life cycles. You have to manage your APIs. If you have people that are not following the rules around the API, and the OWASP has a top 10 list of prime vulnerabilities within APIs. If you're not managing those, you can have privilege escalation. Infrastructure as code. You don't, the traditional model would have been, I would have gone into the data center, I would have plugged in all of the different connections, and I would have done it physically. Now it's all done with a script. How do you know the script is accommodating the necessary security? And in the United States, the concept of having zero trust is becoming mandatory. Containers. How are you dealing with Docker and Kubernetes? There are also some products out there, including cloud native application protection platforms, software as a service security posture management, enhanced identity protection tools, zero trust network access, which is intended to replace the traditional VPN. All of these are brand new toys, and we have to understand how these toys are going to impact the overall risk profile of our organization. And then, of course, the consequence of all of this, in a Gartner study, which I have a link to, 99% of security failures are going to be traced back to the controls not being set properly. And as I am fond of pointing out, I will give the person a nickel for this. When was the last time anybody successfully sued Microsoft or AWS for a data breach? It just doesn't happen. If all of your application providers go into a subscription model, and if you are in a multi-tenancy environment, how are you now managing log files? The tradition of having a SIM in a data center works very nicely. But wait a minute, what happened to all of the different log files from all of the different resources across all of my different clouds? Am I going to pay another cloud service provider to manage that? You could. There will be configuration and change management challenges, especially when you're looking at the shared responsibility model. What level of access do your developers have to production? There are going to be limitations to what you can do in terms of pen testing. The primary rule is you cannot break anybody else's stuff. So if I'm in a multi-tenancy environment, I can't do the same level of testing. I am very limited by the rules of engagement of the cloud service provider. And I need to understand the consequences of breaking someone else's. Then we get to the very interesting problem. And I'm not quite sure how you solve this one, of asset valuation. Historically, if you were to implement some controls or to manage the risk of a server, you would have the invoice of the server, you would know exactly how much the server cost. Well, if everything is a virtual machine, if everything is virtualized, including code, the containers, the cloud native applications, how are we valuing those things to know what we're going to spend on controls? In a multi-tenancy environment, you have to ensure tenant isolation. Simply put, you can't see anybody else's stuff. They can't see your stuff. Who's tested that to make sure that is not the case? I remember very early on when Office 365 first came out, I was one of the first customers. I saw other people in my global address list. And then we have this problem. And I think this is the crux of the problem that every auditor is going to face. We may have control gaps that are going to be caused by failure to understand the shared responsibility model. Now, what I have in front of you is what AWS says you are supposed to do and what they are going to do. So you as the customer are responsible for security in the cloud, including governance over your customer data, platform, application, and identity and access management, the operating system, network and firewall configuration, client-side data encryption and data integrity authentication, server-side encryption, network traffic. What's AWS responsible for? The software controlling compute, storage, database, and networking. The hardware of the physical infrastructure, including the regions, availability zones, and edge locations. But that's it. As far as AWS's shared governance model, these are the controls you fully inherit from AWS. The physical and environmental controls, any shared controls, which are really about the infrastructure layer and the customer layers. Patch management, AWS is responsible for patching and fixing flaws within the infrastructure. You are responsible for patching the guest operating system. How are you managing that? As far as awareness training goes, AWS is going to take care of its own people, but you are supposed to train yours. There is also a very customer-specific responsibility within AWS. The controls which are solely the responsibility of the customer based on the application they are deploying, and they give you an application of service and communication protection or zone security. So you are going to have to divide your network up appropriately. Microsoft, which again, this is my personal opinion, does a slightly better job of explaining this, has also described what their responsibility zones are. So just in terms of what you are supposed to do as the customer, irregardless of the deployment model, you're going to be responsible for data governance, client endpoints, account and access management. And based on how much you want control, if you do infrastructure as a service, you will also then be responsible for identity and directory link infrastructure, applications, network controls, and the operating system. When you start moving into platform as a service and software as a service, there's going to be a shared responsibility where, again, in the case of Microsoft, they are going to be responsible for the physical host, the physical networks, and the physical data center. Microsoft's shared governance model has the customer both accountable and responsible for all aspects of security and operations. If you have infrastructure as a service, the thing that you are responsible for as a customer is securing and managing the operating system, network configuration, applications, identity, clients, and data. if you're doing platform as a service in Azure, the provider is going to be responsible for managing and securing the network controls, but you have a responsibility for securing and managing applications, identity, clients, and data. If it's software as a service, something like Office 365, you are responsible for making sure that the data is classified correctly. Now, I want to pause for 1 second to talk about this ever so briefly. If you simply dump all of your data into the cloud, both Azure and AWS have DLP tools that will try to figure things out for you. But I think it would be a better idea to have classified the data yourself, because again, if you have something like personally identifiable information or personal health information, the consequences of losing that data or misconfiguring it are significant. I do a little bit of training for the companies in the defense industrial base, and the management of controlled and classified information is really important to handle. And you can overprotect or underprotect. Now, what I want to show you is an example of what artifacts you as an auditor would actually need to have for a single control over a single application if you were doing a NIST framework. So this is 853 R5 AC1. The control is that the organization is going to develop, document, and disseminate to, with an organizational defined personnel or roles, an access control policy that does a whole bunch of things. What does Microsoft do as far as AC1? Nothing. The customer is completely responsible for implementing the control. So you as the auditor would need to look for the documentation, the reviewing, the updating, and the dissemination of an access control policy and procedure. The customer's access control policy and procedure addresses all access, including that to virtual machines and customer-built applications. The customer implementation statement should address the content of the policy, which includes purpose, scope, roles, compliance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, who's doing all of this? And you have to understand, I think there's something in the order of 500 controls within 853 R5, and you could extrapolate how many things that you would have to do for ISO 27001. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of this particular shared responsibility model with Microsoft is you can actually get a scorecard as to how many controls have actually been done. And insurance companies in the United States are going to start looking at the way that you deploy to the cloud. And all of that is going to come back and haunt you in terms of accountability, in terms of governance, in terms of compliance with different laws, and the management of cyber risk. So you can essentially see here of the number of controls with any given framework, the number of applications that you may have, the amount of modifications you may need to do to any risk register you may have. You're looking at every application and control where there is a shared responsibility across all of your cloud providers, covering all of the compliance and data or an organization collects and manages across all of the clouds that you use. And then you still have the additional problem of, oh, wait a minute, I've got my part covered. As a customer, I can make sure that everybody who's putting an application in the cloud is following all of the guidance, all of the standards we have put forth to them as they were going to the cloud. But now you start having the problem of how do you know the cloud providers are doing their part? Now, this is from an ISACA document. It essentially comes or it covers, if you will, everything that is going to be managed by GRC and everything for all intents and purposes that needs to now be modified, where you are covering not only and satisfying and managing the risk appetite of the organization, but dealing with external obligations as well, especially in the areas of compliance around the movement of data. What we're going to try to promote is a mechanism that's going to support compliance and audit assurance. So we need a way for people to prove they do what they say they do. Hopefully that will give us some operational efficiencies and improve the effectiveness of all of the controls. Now, this is from an ISACA document that you ISACA members can get. These are their cloud governance recommendations. And the document in particular comes from the Cloud Computing Audit Program. So these are very specific controls. First of all, the governance of cloud computing services. You are supposed to have governance functions in place to ensure effective and sustainable management processes that result in the transparency of business decisions, clear lines of authority, information security in alignment with regulatory and customer organization standards and accountability. Your enterprise risk management is also going to be different. In particular, you need to evaluate what is the inherent risk within the cloud computing model. You're supposed to have the appropriate control mechanisms. And if there is residual risk, as we will discuss when we will find control gaps, do they remain in acceptable levels, within acceptable levels? There is also, again, the obligation to manage information security risk and to now incorporate this into the overall enterprise risk management frameworks that you have. We need to manage risk within the risk tolerance of a data owner, who, by the way, is probably not going to understand how the cloud works. This next one is really tricky. That is, and I'm going to simply describe this one. You are the data controller. It was your bright idea to go to the cloud. If something happens, it's going to be your fault. You might have legal recourse against somebody, but how do you know for sure everybody's doing what they are supposed to do? There are a couple of particular areas that could be a problem. If you use software as a service as an example, that software as a service provider is probably using a platform as a service or infrastructure as a service that belongs to somebody else. How do you know what they're doing with your data? There is also the issue, and again, this is a significant one, and you're going to need to make your attorneys and lawyers very happy about this. How are you going to find everything that you're putting into the cloud if you did not have a data-centric architecture in the first place? In many circumstances, you have discovery requirements if they're in the event of a lawsuit. How do you know you're going to be able to find everything? And you needed to have done this before you went into the cloud, not after. I question whether you will have the ability to do a right to audit. If you represent a government, it's more likely. If you're, I would say, a Honeywell or a General Motors, maybe you will have the right to audit, but I'm willing to bet that it will be for smaller providers or providers that are new to the marketplace. The right to audit may be part of what your audit charter has in it as far as third-party vendor management. So you may have this tension between the normal right to audit of third party, which is perhaps a requirement in your audit charter, and then what are you able to actually do with a cloud service provider? As far as auditability, the service provider's operating environment should be subject to audit. Doesn't say who's going to do the audit. The compliance scope, use of cloud computing doesn't change any of the rules. What kind of certifications do the cloud service providers actually have? If they are compliant, you are more likely to be compliant if you do your part. AWS is a very interesting compliance page because, and I find it very interesting, and again, I don't have the time to show everything here. It's interesting in this regard. It lists every single regulation and law out there, which you have to consider because you got to know where your stuff is. And then there is the notion of service transition planning. How do you know everything is working exactly the same way? If I say I'm going from a traditional ERP application on-prem, and now I'm going to use a cloud service, does 1 + 1 still equal 2? Do your test plans still adequately cover everything? So this is ISACA's recommendation that you probably should have done before you went to the cloud, not after. So far, we've looked at all of the reasons people want to run to the cloud in the first place and what happens. And I describe this as the cloud fast syndrome. Lots of bad things can happen. The shared responsibility model, I think, is the biggest problem. And we've gone over some of the governance recommendations from ISACA. However, there are some other things we may have a problem with. What if we don't have a right to audit? What if we have a lot of different frameworks that are part of what your organization is supposed to be compliant with? How do you know the cloud providers are doing what they are supposed to be doing? So I like to describe this as kind of the need for either a Rosetta Stone or a lingua franca. In other words, a common language that allows you to understand what the cloud providers are doing and how you can assess what the level of risk actually is from a control gap. So part 2 of our discussion is going to be about the Cloud Security Alliance's control matrix, what they refer to as the CCAK, which is a form of self-assessment. And there is a place that you can go to get an understanding of how people are doing their cloud governance. That is the STAR registry. Now, of course, you're not going to get a lot of detail. You're going to get enough detail to be able to ask questions. Because again, all of this stuff that's in the STAR registry is in the public domain. So what's the cloud matrix all about? It's cloud-specific controls created by industry consensus. I would highly recommend, not only for you're taking the test and passing the exam, but to acquire general knowledge. You really need to spend a lot of time on the Cloud Security Alliance site. As an example, there are controls that have been recommended by the Cloud Security Alliance around deployments or around hyperledgers and Corda, which is a bespoke blockchain. These things do not exist in NIST. They do not exist in ISO. So if you need to at least have an understanding of what is supposed to be there, it is a good thing. So if you are a member of the STAR registry, you agree to document their adherence to the control framework. This is above and beyond what you might find in a SOC 1, 2, and 3, which is based on trusted services criteria controls. This is my theory as to why this works. If you're a cloud service provider, one of your obligations is to make sure that people can move from one cloud provider to another. Well, if everybody's doing the same controls, at least that takes the argument off that table. The cloud control matrix maps against all of the major control frameworks. And the good thing about the cloud control matrix is they're continuously updating it. They've gone from 4 to 4.05 at this point. So it is constantly evolving with the emerging technologies that that you should be looking at. Now, the presentation, which you'll have access to, has links to the CSA's security guidance and the Cloud Security Alliance's Enterprise Reference Guide. I would strongly recommend, especially if you intend to take the test at some point, that you go through those documents to understand how these things were put into place. There is also a peer review process for all of the controls, and there is what they call the CSA research lifecycle. When people make modifications to the cloud control matrix, you have 3 forms of releases. So, and by the way, I think you need to know this for the test. You have a full or major release, which would be going from 3 to 4, which is the latest version. There was, in the case of when they went from 3 to 4, revisions in the cloud control matrix domain structure. In other words, they changed some names around and they moved some things around. You would also get a major release if there was a technical change, either revision, addition, or deletion of a number of controls greater than 10%. A dot release is a form, follows the forms of Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Control Matrix modifications, which might include a change in the matrix column or a technical change of the number of controls smaller than 10%. Minor changes, and again, they're up to 4.05, constitutes changes that could be editorial in nature, updated control framework mappings, which again is a good thing. New control framework mappings, that is the introduction of new control frameworks mapped to previously published controls. You as the customer are going to use these controls in this manner. With the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to map all of your organizational, operational, and legal requirements to the control objectives as stated by the Cloud Control Matrix. You can build an operational cloud risk management program. You can build a third-party risk management program. And finally, and perhaps the most important thing, how are you going to review all of the applications that are going to be put into the cloud? You would need to understand what the controls are in the first place. So this whole idea of the Cloud Control Matrix is going to help you build a cloud risk management program. Again, it would be better if you had this before you went to the cloud, but after the fact will do. What is exceptionally important is understanding not only the gaps, but the capabilities of the cloud service security providers. They're going to give you options to things that you may never have considered before, but if it brings your residual risk down further from going into the cloud, that will be a good thing. And then, of course, you're going to come up into the issue of, well, wait a minute, I've got a control that's not covered by the Cloud Control Matrix. You're going to have to figure out what a good compensating control is, again, to keep the risk profile at a level that is acceptable. So if you are building a third-party risk management program, you can assess the cloud service. It can be used as an initial evaluation between the different cloud service providers. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through the control domains. And I'm not going to touch on every single control within those control domains. But what I want to point out is that A, some control domains are going to be much more important than others. And B, I want you to pay attention to what the potential differences are between the way you might do something within a traditional control framework and the way it might otherwise be done. So the first control domain we're going to take a look at is audit and assurance. Now with audit and assurance, the controls include having an audit and assurance policy and procedure. Now again, this is what the cloud providers are doing. They have documented, they're able to evaluate and maintain audit and assurance policies and procedures and standards, and they will describe how they do that. Again, you can go to the STAR registry and look at any cloud provider's implementation of these controls. They support independent assessments. These are your SOC 1, 2, and 3s. There is risk-based planning assessment, requirements compliance against all of the applicable laws and regulations, audit management, that is the ability to support audit planning, risk analysis, security control assessments, remediation schedules, report generations, review of past reports, and finally remediation. Now, the next one is probably one of the ones that I would consider to be the most impactful, if for no other reason that your current system development lifecycle may need some modification. So there are, and this is about the management of things like APIs, application interface security policies and procedures, where they go out and evaluate and maintain the policies. There are security baseline requirements, largely around the standards produced by the OWASP. There are some very interesting things being done in terms of application security metrics. They're establishing server level objectives for all of these controls, by the way. There is secure application design and development. Again, privacy by design would be a major consideration. Automated application security testing, automated secure application deployment, application vulnerability remediation. Now, the next one is one of the ones that I consider to be important, largely because it's the most impactful in terms of changes. So I don't want to go through all of these controls, but what I want you to focus in on the fact is that there is likely to be a gap in terms of testing things like business continuity and operational resilience. Because it's not like you're going to tell AWS or Azure to go turn off your service so that we can see what happens. How are you testing all of this? Another major area of concern is going to be change control and configuration management. If you have a traditional structure in place to manage the risk of something going wrong, either because a change wasn't authorized or because a configuration wasn't managed, a baseline wasn't managed, well, now you need to look at what the capabilities of the cloud providers are going to be and where are the gaps between what you currently do and what you're going to have to be assessing in the cloud. Now, of all the things that I teach when I teach cloud security, the one that absolutely scares me the most is this one. That is cryptography, encryption, and key management. Now, there's a bunch of different things going on. Some countries don't like the idea of your encrypting your data. A lot of organizations, frankly, do not understand encryption at all, and how are they going to manage encryption keys? There are horror stories out there of people putting keys in code that is publicly available. So of all the things that I would be worried about before anybody went into the cloud, what I want you to pay attention to here is the fact that there are 14, actually, let me take that back, 21 different controls around cryptography, encryption, and key management. And the most difficult fundamental decision that needs to be made is, can you manage cryptographic keys? And if you can't, can you trust someone else to do that for you? As I'm fond of telling my classes, if you're a provider of cryptographic key management services and some nation asks for a private key that belongs to you, are you actually able to go to court and say, no, don't give it to them? Nobody's going to go to jail for you. So again, please be very, very careful about key management. Data center security is actually the thing I worry about the least, because again, the cloud service providers all spend billions of dollars in terms of protecting their data centers. They're fairly anonymous locations that are well air conditioned, and that the temperature and humidity controls are going to be fine. And the way that you get into the data centers is also going to be fairly robust. So this, of all the controls, probably the one I'm worried about the least. Not that you don't have to test it, but compared to what your typical data center looks like, it's going to be much better. And again, we have a fairly significant number of controls around that. If I am designing a cloud instance today, I'm doing it around data. And here again, because privacy is becoming one of the most significant compliance risks that you can have, understanding how data is managed in the cloud is going to be challenging. And I just want to touch on one aspect of it, that is disposal of data. In the case of Microsoft, they give you 90 days if you decide to terminate your agreement to get your data off. It might take, because of different mechanisms to provide redundancy to your data, another 90 days for your data to disappear. Are you good with 180 days of your data being in the cloud without any control? I wouldn't think so. And here too, when you look at the volume and the number of controls that you would need to evaluate just to identify gaps, there's 19 of them. Governance, risk, and compliance is another one of those domains where you would expect a risk management program and a policy exception process. Again, not terribly worried about that one. As far as human resources go, here again, you're trusting your data to a third party. You would like to ensure that these individuals are adequately vetted. I think the most interesting space other than cryptography is going to be identity and access management going forward. There is a whole bunch of work being done right now around distributed digital identities. So I'm predicting within 5 years, we won't have Active Directory anymore, but we'll have some form of blockchain-based identity. The one point I want to make about identity and access management is user provisioning and deprovisioning is becoming much more complicated. I need to be able to make sure that somebody goes away rather quickly. And the general consensus seems to be that I'm going to start doing identity management in the cloud, synchronizing on-prem. So here again, you have a fairly substantial number of controls put into place. Everything is becoming open. The whole idea is you need to be able to move your data from one cloud service provider to another. Proprietary is really, really, really bad. If somebody is offering you a cloud-based service that is proprietary in nature, it's a mousetrap. You won't get away. With virtualization and infrastructure security, again, there are all kinds of potential problems that have occurred over the years, largely based around Intel processors being somewhat flawed. But the whole idea behind the infrastructure and virtualization security is really going to be one around making sure no one can see your stuff and you can't see anybody else's. One of the more challenging aspects of this entire movement to the cloud is what are you doing with all of the log files that you have? There's going to be a fairly substantial number. And if you're doing this across multiple clouds, well, are you going to let a single cloud provider manage all your log files for you? Are you going to bring all the log files back on-prem? Are you going to maintain multiple copies of log files? How are you doing this across multiple clouds? From an architectural perspective, there's a high level of risk because we have become extremely reliant on the detective capabilities that logging gives us. And if we don't have that capability, it's not going to end well if we have a problem. And again, your visibility is going to vary based on the type of service you sign up for. You'll have the least amount of visibility in the log files with software as a service. So again, managing all of these controls is going to be an issue. To keep your lawyers happy and keep the government agencies happy, you're going to need to be able to have a handle around security incident management. Incident management is now a major requirement of a lot of government agencies, data protection authorities, and the time span keeps shrinking. I remember reading a week or so ago that in India, it's 6 hours. 6 hours is the proposal. How do you know you had an incident across multiple clouds? Your lawyers need to figure out e-discovery, again, depending how litigious your country happens to be. And there is some really good documentation up on the Microsoft site that illustrates the complexity of chain of custody in cloud forensics. For a supply chain is obviously becoming a bigger and bigger issue, where, at least in my estimation, the bigger problem is going to be around ownership of clouds. Let us hypothetically say that a government that you don't necessarily agree with takes over a cloud service provider. Now, what do you do? Maintaining supply chain risk management is becoming very, very critical, as is cyber supply chain risk management. So we have accountability and we have a whole bunch of controls and documentation around it. It would be third parties that a cloud service provider uses because, again, you lack the privity of contract to be able to actually sue somebody. And finally, and this is the last, I believe the last one, that is vulnerability and threat management. So who's patching what becomes the major question. And especially as more and more desktops wind their way up as virtual machines in the cloud, who's accountable for what? What are you capable of doing in terms of identifying vulnerabilities within either your cloud instance or in the overall cloud infrastructure? Again, For threat and vulnerability management, to identify where there are vulnerabilities, you need to be able to follow the terms of engagement. And you should also probably be doing a lot of shifting left in terms of application development on-prem, doing DevSecOps and setting up security gates for continuous integration and continuous deployment is going to be a really good idea. There is a little bit about endpoint management, and I kind of laugh about this one because I keep bringing this up in class. What happens, hypothetically, if you have an employee who downloads a document onto a refrigerator? Now, some of you may be laughing, but some refrigerators have browsers in them. So if a refrigerator has a browser in it and somebody downloads something, how are you getting the data off? There are ways of doing it, but you needed to know that that was a particular problem, and they're asking you about endpoint inventory. One of the major challenges that you have is that your attack surface is growing exponentially, with all kinds of devices now able to connect to your cloud instance because everything is connected. It's the IoT syndrome. But as I need to remind you, this recently happened, what goes up can come down. So you're going to need to worry about all of the endpoints and all of the data that is associated with it. So again, I'm kind of keeping my eye on the clock, so to speak, here, because again, there's so much to talk about. I do want to talk about one more thing, though. That is the idea of firewalls. You have to understand, you may get a firewall from the cloud service provider, but is it the right kind of firewall? And by that, I mean, again, if I am doing a firewall for a cloud service provider, I need to let port 443 in at a minimum. But what if I needed to do something else? So just because there is a firewall, is it an appropriate firewall, or do I need an application level firewall as well? So we've now gone through all of the control domains. And what do you do next? Well, you have lots of reading to do. First, there is a cloud control matrix implementation guide that gives you an idea as to how things were supposed to be done. There is also a cloud control matrix auditing guide, just in case you are in a position to actually audit a cloud provider. There are going to be some things that you're going to need to do, in your company need to figure out. And the first one is going to be, who is responsible for implementing a given cloud control matrix control between a cloud service provider and a cloud service customer? So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of part of the cloud control matrix. Here we have the typical control applicability and ownership. And for this particular example, it is shared across infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. So it could be cloud service provider owned, it could be cloud service customer owned or shared. And if it's shared, you need to understand what you are supposed to be doing. There is, within the cloud control matrix, an architectural relevance and cloud stack. So something, a particular control could be applied across, in this instance, the physical, but not network, compute, storage. It would apply to the application and it would apply to the data. The individual controls can be assigned in terms of accountability to different parts of your organization. Again, these are recommendations from the Cloud Security Alliance. You have cybersecurity, internal audit, the architecture team, software development, operations, legal privacy, GRC, supply chain management, and HR. All of these people represent stakeholders. And this is the part that's going to take a lot of work. Because now what you're looking at is, well, what framework am I using? So in this particular instance, we have a control domain of audit and assurance. We have a control title and a control ID. The control specification says exactly what the control is supposed to do. Now, what we can take a look at is what control within our environment would be the appropriate framework and the appropriate control. So if, as an example, we were using ISO 27001 and 2 or 17 and 18, 17 and 18, by the way, are updates to the original 27001 and 2. 18 covers additional privacy controls. The control mapping in particular is 9.2. And what we have in this particular case is identified as a control gap. What we have here when we have the control gap is there are things that are missing and requirements of at least annually, which may or may not be correct. The Cloud Security Alliance has defined 3 kinds of gap levels. If there is no gap, there is a full matching of the control from the cloud control matrix to another framework. If there is a partial gap, the target standard does not fully satisfy the corresponding cloud control matrix's control requirements. If there is a full gap, there's no control in the target standard to fulfill the corresponding cloud control matrix control requirement. Now, here's your choice. Obviously, it is a control from the cloud control matrix if there is a full gap. Is it one that you actually need? Is it something that you're going to have to accept risk over? After all of that is done, now we've got to figure out how the cloud providers are supporting the controls. So there is something that is referred to as the Control Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire, where in this particular case, you have the control specification and the question. So you're going to have the ID, question ID, and the question, and what you would find. And again, I would encourage you all to go to the STAR registry and take a look at AWS's or Microsoft's. They will answer how they do the control, not in a lot of detail, but they will explain it. We also have this. That is the Security, Trust, Assurance, and Risk STAR registry. It's publicly accessible. If you sign up as a CSA corporate member, there's training and volunteer requirements as well. And there's 2 levels at the moment. There's a 3rd level that they're proposing that's not quite there yet because it's past its due date, but it involves APIs that you would actually be able to look at the cloud control matrix controls in near real time to make sure they still work. But at the moment, we have 2, a STAR level 1 and a STAR level 2. With the STAR level 1, it can be a self-assessment. So you're a cloud service provider, you belong to the Cloud Security Alliance, you fill out a form, and what it can include in the self-assessment is also the GDPR Code of Conduct. There are 2 variations of a level 1 that is a security self-assessment. It's all of your documentations, you as the cloud provider submitting the CCAK to document your compliance with the cloud control matrix. There is also another variation of level 1, which is a GDPR self-assessment. So to do that one, it's going to be publication of the relevant document on the registry. You get a compliance mark valid for 1 year. It is voluntary publication of on the STAR registry of 2 documents, the Code of Conduct Statement of Adherence, and one that you should take a look at. This is a privacy level agreement code of practice template that is an annex to the self-assessment results. There are a couple of different flavors to level 2, which is a third-party audit. Now, the companies that they recommend pursuing a level 2 include operating in a medium to high risk environment. I would think that handling anything around PHI or PII would be part of that. They typically also need to adhere to 27001, a SOC 2, GBT 22080 or GDPR. The GBT is a Chinese standard. They're also looking for a cost-effective way to ensure increased insurance for cloud security and privacy. That is a fancy way of saying, look, we can't let you audit us here. We've done something beyond the traditional SOC report. And those variations include a STAR attestation for SOC 2. So what we're looking at here is using the Trusted Services Criteria Principles, that is AT 101, alongside the Cloud Control Matrix controls. There is also a STAR certification for ISO 27001. It's technology neutral certification. It takes all of the standards requirements within 27001 and it maps them together with the Cloud Control Matrix. Finally, for the Greater China market, because the Chinese have their own standard, there is something that is referred to as C-STAR. So if you do significant amounts of business in China and the Chinese have a particular requirement, you might find that this is appropriate. So it's the Cloud Control Matrix plus 29 controls from their standard. That is the Chinese standard. So the final thing we're going to talk about before we answer some questions, and I'm sure there's a few, is what does the class look like? First, I don't know how much longer it's going to stay 2 days. I had a conversation with someone, and the problem that I have with this class, I barely get through it. If I have 7 hours per day to teach over 2 days, I just about make it over the line. So what you get out of this class is a lot more, frankly, what we have been discussing. That is, we're going to look at some clouds that we look at, cloud security assessment methods and techniques, making sure that the cloud service is in alignment with what your company requirements are. If you are an auditor, it will give you a greater understanding of what is involved with the cloud and the cloud control matrix. So module 1, which is, again, I usually do module 1 and 2 on day 1. It's about governance and how to establish the governance, cloud assurance, all of the different frameworks, risk management in the cloud, and the cloud governance tools. Module 2 is about developing a cloud compliance program and then evaluating it. Satisfying all of your legal and regulatory requirements, identifying what standards and security frameworks you want to use. Then we go over the controls in the Cloud Control Matrix and the CCAK. And unfortunately, you're going to need to know the mappings and the transition from earlier versions to Cloud Control Matrix version 4. Then there is a scenario that they build out, and there is a document up on the Cloud Security Alliance site that is a threat analysis methodology. We'll give you the skills to evaluate your cloud compliance program. We'll go over how you would go out and audit the cloud, how you would scope the cloud control matrix, and what I think is probably the most difficult part. We talk about continuous assurance and compliance. And it's not as though you need to be an expert in DevSecOps, but the process of auditing continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines and all of the security gates are going to be the way that you are going to provide your own organization assurance that kind of, in one respect, replaces the traditional dev, staging, production kind of environment. Then we go over the STAR program in a degree of detail. Again, the only one that is not official as of yet is STAR Level 3. The exam itself, 76 multiple choice questions. It's 2 hours. When you pass, you're going to know that immediately, and you will get a verification within 10 days, very traditional ISACA-like. It's virtual only. Now, again, I want to just give you a little bit of warning. The devices that I tend to have that are browsers or that are portable, like a laptop, have a lot of stuff on them. There's virtualization, there's all kinds of added tools. All of it has got to be tested. You're going to need to install a lockdown browser, and actually you're going to need to do it twice. So make sure if you're going to take the exam that you understand what is involved in installing the browser, because it does kind of keep track of your eye movements and the way that you talk. If you talk to yourself, you're in trouble. So just make sure you understand the rules of engagement with the people that are proctoring the exam. So even something as mundane as going to the bathroom, I've taken some of these exams that are virtual only. Some people will say, okay, yes, you can take a break. Other people say you can't take a break. Whew. Alta, I did it with 15 minutes to spare for questions.
Thank you, Ted. So much information. Now I feel like I knew nothing before.
Well, if I've given you food for thought, then I've done my job. And I hope everybody else has enjoyed it, frankly. Hello.
Thank you to self.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You look like you were frozen for just a second.
Oh, okay, sorry. So for everyone, if they have questions, they can.
You're freezing just a little bit, Salta.
Oh, I think I'm losing. Evgeny, can you take over?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Sultan. Colleagues, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat window and we will pass them to Ted. Ted, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I'm just, digesting it, and I'm quite sure that it will be more than once that I will review the recording. It's a lot to think through.
Well, and the one thing, again, I would encourage all of you to do is to visit the Cloud Security Alliance site and go through their documentation. It's very, very, very important that you do that. Because again, you're not going to become an expert in this overnight. And one thing that I do to try to stay apace, if you will, with all of these different technologies, I spend a lot of time watching AWS and Azure videos on YouTube, and from all of the different service providers. That's probably the only way that you're going to be able to get up to speed in a hurry if you needed to. And remember, at the end of the day, auditors do not need to be experts in everything. You do need to have a degree of technical competency, but it's more important that you understand what people are supposed to do and are they doing it. So it's understanding what the controls are supposed to be and what people say that they are going to do. And let me just add one more thing about the course itself. It's a 2-day class. But if your organization was looking to bring a lot of people up to speed in this particular space, I think it would be a really good idea to bundle this and a CISA class at the same time, because unfortunately the CISA just touches on cloud. But as you can see from this presentation, there's so much more that goes into it. So you would almost think of it, the CISA as being an undergraduate degree and the CCAK class as being a doctorate program.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We have 2 questions in the chat at the moment. First one is, what about using Stride and DREAD for risk assessment purposes?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
What about using STRID and DRIEAD for risk assessment?
Yes. In fact, both are referenced as perfectly acceptable methodologies, especially when you're doing the threat assessments. Yeah, those actually are part of the class.
Okay.
So those are fine. Yeah. And again, Microsoft has got some really good documentation regarding threats and vulnerabilities, particular to a deployment and a particular framework. Again, look at the Microsoft site. They've got some really, really strong documentation about that.
Thank you. And one more question. If I use logs from 2 different cloud service providers, also I have to be sure of proper clock synchronization between service providers.
Yeah, it's a much more complicated question, because again, how do you know it's only going to be 2 service providers at any given point in time, and your log files, frankly, could be distributed all over the world. So are you setting the clocks to UTC time? How are you managing these log files? There's any number of different ways of approaching it. The providers, the major providers like Microsoft and the AWS, will both be perfectly willing to take your money to manage your log files for you. But you've got to decide how you're going to want to do that. I do have one more thing I want to add here. Again, if you have any questions, you want to link, send me an email, that's fine. And I got a contact person at ISACA to talk to. Again, this deck is going to be out there. His name is Jorge Tovar, and he's at isaca.org. He can arrange for training or answer any of your questions around training. And finally, because I have to show this because it's the official end of the presentation, here is the website for the chapter, the Nur-Sultan chapter, and the emails for everybody. So they'll be able to, you can reach out to them. You run this again.
Ted, I have one more question. I switched to my backup line.
Okay.
I only have 2 lines.
No.
So the question is about cloud services right now advertise that they are PCI DSS compliant, that they are GDPR compliant.
Yes.
They say, okay, you put your data, we're compliant, don't worry. What are your thoughts on that?
The problem is the shared responsibility model. They might be responsible for the portions they control, but what about the portions that are shared as a responsibility? That would be one of the major concerns I would have. The other PCI DSS requirement that's going to be on the tricky side, because again, the number of controls around cryptographic controls is substantial. Who's going to manage the encryption of that PCI DSS data, which is required? Is it you? How exactly are you managing all of those keys? Because remember, if you lock your data up and you lose the keys, you're not getting it back. People don't have quantum computers handy to go do cryptanalysis on your encryption keys. Again, you can be PCI DSS compliant, or you can state that you're PCI DSS compliant for the controls that you are accountable for. But for everything else, you still have to do your part, especially around the management of the data. The data is going to be your responsibility at the end of the day, irregardless of the cloud service provider. The way you organize the data, the way that you set up your databases, that is all on you at the end of the day. So I hope I've answered everybody's questions.
Okay, great. That here many people, participants are writing. Thanks a lot for your effort in delivering tough IT things to us finance and accounting guys. It was insightful and perfect presentation. And there is a comment from participant. I think that despite that CCSP is GDPR compliant, the customer is ultimately always responsible for data collected.
They are responsible for the data and the governance. So what you always have to remember is it was your bright idea to collect the data. And so you as the data controller are ultimately responsible for everything. Do you have legal recourse if a cloud service provider makes a mistake? Yeah, but you're still going to be the first one that's going to get sued. Okay. So again, it is about conceptualizing. What is it you want to do with all of the data that previously was siloed and now could conceivably be in one big bucket? How do you want to leverage the data that you have collected? Do you want to do AI? Do you want to do machine learning? You want to do decision support systems? Do you want to become Amazon? Do you want to become Google? What's it you would like to do with all of this data that you're collecting? Lifting and shifting is a waste of time and money, in my opinion. If all you're doing is taking what you have and putting it in the cloud, why are you doing that? Because that has risk associated with it as well, with the primary risk being, there goes your data center, there goes all of your talent, nobody has anything anymore.
Great. And last question, Ted, we have a few minutes.
Sure.
That I encountered. Oh, here's another question from participants. Is there any methodology about how we can keep encryption keys?
Yes, plenty. First of all, what I think you would like to understand is how do the major vendors provide that service? Because again, you're going to be comparing what it is you want to do versus what you can buy. And if you don't have the technical competence to manage the keys, I probably would give it to somebody else, even though there are potential legal issues. Now, regarding cryptographic key management, if you go to the Cloud Security Alliance website and look up cryptographic keys, you will find their documentation and their recommendations. So between the different vendors, the major vendors, AWS and Microsoft, and you go to the Cloud Security Alliance, you'll find everything that you need.
Right.
And by the way, if there are any people from any other countries out there, if you'd like this presentation delivered again to your particular country, I'd be more than happy to do it. So just feel free to reach out to me and we'll set it up. I can do this again. Hard work is all done.
Thank you, Ted, very much. And the last questions that I wanted to ask that I encountered in my experience. So people buy cloud, let's say Microsoft Office and AWS.
Mm-hmm.
Then mostly they would like to get security controls like DLP to have more visibility from security vendors like McAfee, Symantec, and integrated. What your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, again, from the major vendors, they will be very happy to sell you those services. DLP from Amazon is referred to as Macy. That is their product. And Microsoft has a fairly robust DLP solution as well. How it integrates within the environment, that you've got to talk to a system engineer for. I cannot provide that answer.
Okay. Okay.
Again, the big problem you have is if you're just dumping all of your data into the cloud, are you overprotecting the data or underprotecting the data? The example I gave earlier of controlled and classified information, that requires particularly special handling of a cloud provider offering a very specific government level service. Well, if I dump all of my data and protect it at CUI levels, I'm spending way too much money to do that.
Thank you very much, Ted. You were just on time.
I know, it's a gift.
90 minutes. And thank you for participants for participating in this webinar. And thank you very much, Ted. I know for sure when I was looking someone who can speak about cloud security, because most people know just a little. So it was an honor to have you, Ted.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. I'm looking forward to doing this again.
And thank you to you from our internal audit community. And it's a treasure. And while Sultanat says just a little, I would say that close to nothing from our side, probably. From many of us, not everyone, but from many of us. So I think this is just an invaluable gift to everyone on our professional community.
It was my pleasure. Tell your friends and neighbors. I'll do this again.
Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.